The gravel crunched beneath their tires as the young couple pulled into the secluded clearing. It was a warm summer night in 1968, just outside Florence, and Barbara Lacci and her lover Antonio Lo Bianco had found their usual spot. A quiet stretch of countryside where the cypress trees stood like sentinels against the Tuscan sky. They had no idea they were being watched. Inside the car, whispered conversations turned to laughter, then silence. The windows fogged. The crickets sang their evening chorus. Everything seemed perfect, ordinary even. But somewhere in the darkness beyond their headlights, someone was moving closer. What happened next would haunt Italy for nearly 3 decades. At 10:30 p.m., a farmer living nearby heard what he thought were firecrackers. Pop, pop, pop. He went back to his dinner, thinking nothing of it. By morning, 2 bodies would be discovered in that car, riddled with bullets from a .22 Beretta. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the violence itself. It was what the killer had done after. Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino, had been asleep in the back seat. When police found him wandering along the road in the early morning hours, his clothes were soaked with his mother's blood. "My mama's dead," he told them, his voice hollow. The child had witnessed something no one should ever see, but what he couldn't tell them was far more terrifying. The killer had let him live. Why? Let me pause here and reach out to you directly. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you lying in bed in Mexico City, curled up on a couch in Buenos Aires, or perhaps driving through the night somewhere in the United States? I'd love to know. Drop your location in the comments below. There's something powerful about knowing we're all here together, scattered across the world, united by our need to understand the darkness that sometimes touches our lives. If this is your first time joining me, welcome. This channel exists to tell true crime stories with the depth and respect they deserve. We don't sensationalize. We don't exploit. We remember the victims as human beings, not just headlines. If that approach speaks to you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you're already part of this community, thank you. Your support, a like, a comment, sharing this video with someone who values well-researched true crime, keeps this work alive. It means more than I can express. Now let's return to Florence, because that night in 1968 was just the beginning. The investigation into Barbara and Antonio's murders went nowhere fast. Police initially suspected Barbara's husband, Stefano Malvetti, a classic crime of passion. He was arrested, tried, and eventually acquitted. For 6 years, the case went cold, buried in filing cabinets and fading memories. But the killer wasn't finished. He was just waiting. September 14th, 1974. 6 years had passed since that first attack, and Florence had nearly forgotten about the lovers found dead in their car. Then it happened again. Pasquale Gentilecore and Stefania Pettini, both 19 years old, had driven to a secluded spot in the countryside for an evening alone. They parked near an abandoned cemetery, a place where young couples often went seeking privacy. By morning, their bodies told a story of unimaginable horror. The same .22 Beretta had been used, the same methodical execution, but this time the killer had done something new, something that made even hardened investigators turn pale. Stefania's body had been violated after death, stabbed repeatedly in a ritualistic pattern. The killer was escalating, and he was sending a message. Detective Adolfo Izzo stood over the crime scene, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. He'd seen murders before. Florence wasn't immune to violence, but this was different. This felt personal, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "We're dealing with someone who enjoys this," he muttered to his partner. "And he's going to do it again." How right he was. But even Izzo couldn't have predicted what was coming. The third attack came in 1981, 7 years later. By now, the Florentine countryside had become a hunting ground, and young couples were the prey. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio made the fatal mistake of parking their Fiat on a quiet country road one June evening. The killer approached with the same precision he'd shown before, swift, silent, deadly. The .22 Beretta barked 4 times. But what he did afterward would become his signature, the detail that would earn him his name, Il Mastro di Firenze. The Monster of Florence. He mutilated Carmela's body with a surgical precision that suggested knowledge, experience, perhaps even pleasure. He removed parts of her, taking them with him into the night like trophies. This wasn't random violence anymore. This was ritual. The Italian media erupted. Headlines screamed warnings to young lovers. Stay away from the countryside. The monster strikes again. But the most chilling realization was slowly dawning on investigators. When they test-fired the 22 Beretta bullets from all 3 crime scenes, the ballistics matched perfectly. The same gun, the same killer, across 13 years. How many more would die before they caught him? The answer would shock an entire nation. By 1982, Florence was gripped by paranoia. The countryside that had once been a romantic escape had become a place of dread. Yet couples continued to seek privacy in those dark lanes and hidden clearings, perhaps believing that lightning couldn't strike twice in the same place. They were wrong. On June 19, 1982, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini became the monster's 4th confirmed victims. Same location pattern, same weapon, same mutilation. The killer was following a script, but whose? His own twisted imagination or something darker? Chief Inspector Silvia Della Monica assembled a task force of 20 detectives. They worked 18-hour days, chasing leads that evaporated like morning fog. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. They staked out lovers' lanes for months. And yet, the monster seemed to know their every move, always one step ahead, always watching. It's like he knows we're coming, one detective complained during a late-night briefing. Like he's listening to our radios. Could the monster be someone close to the investigation? The thought was too terrible to consider, yet it refused to go away. Then came September 9, 1983, and everything changed. Horst Meyer and Uwe Rusch weren't supposed to die that night. They were German tourists, 2 young men traveling through Tuscany in a Volkswagen van. They'd parked in a secluded area to sleep, completely unaware of Florence's dark secret. The monster approached their van in the darkness, expecting to find another young couple. What he found instead would reveal something crucial about his psychology. He opened fire anyway. Horst died instantly. Uwe, wounded, managed to stumble from the van and collapse in the grass, where he bled out beneath the stars. When police arrived at dawn, they found a scene that made no sense. Why would the monster kill 2 men? There had been no mutilation, no ritualistic elements. The murders seemed almost hurried, disappointed. Criminal psychologist Francesco Bruno studied the scene photographs for hours. He made a mistake, Bruno concluded. He thought they were a couple. When he realized they weren't, he panicked. This tells us something important. He needs the woman. The ritual requires her. But why? What was driving this monster to hunt, to kill, to mutilate? The answer would come from the most unlikely source: a letter. In 1984, Florence newspapers received a package that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Inside was a small piece of flesh, removed from one of the previous victims, and a letter. The monster was communicating. The letter was crude, filled with misspellings and grammatical errors, suggesting someone with limited education. But the message was clear. The monster was proud of his work. He was mocking the police, and he wasn't finished. "You will never catch me," the letter read. "I am everywhere and nowhere. I am the shadow in your countryside, the fear in your hearts." Forensic document analyst Maria Esposito examined the letter under magnification. The handwriting showed signs of stress, pressure points where the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "Whoever wrote this was angry," she noted. "Not just at the police, but at something deeper. This is rage that's been building for years, maybe decades." The task force now faced a terrible question. Were they dealing with one killer, or could there be more? Some investigators believed the killings showed too much consistency to be the work of multiple people. Others pointed to the long gaps between murders, sometimes years, and wondered if the monster was actually several people working together. What they didn't know was that the monster was about to accelerate his timeline, and the next victims would change everything. Pia Rontini and Claudio Stefanaxi were deeply in love. At just 18 and 21, they had their whole lives ahead of them. On the evening of June 29, 1984, they drove Claudio's father's Fiat to a quiet spot in the countryside near Vicchio. They wanted privacy, a few hours away from parents and responsibilities. The monster was waiting. This time, he struck with unprecedented brutality. Both victims were shot multiple times, and Pia's body was subjected to the most extensive mutilation yet. The killer seemed to be refining his technique, taking his time, savoring the act. Police arrived to find a scene so disturbing that several officers requested transfers off the case. But there was something new. Witnesses in the area reported seeing a dark car leaving the scene shortly after the estimated time of death. A Fiat Ritmo, they said, though they couldn't make out the license plate in the darkness. For the first time, police had something concrete. They began searching for every dark Fiat Ritmo in the Florence area. There were thousands. The task seemed impossible, but they had to try, because if they didn't catch the monster soon, he would kill again. And he would do it in less than 2 months. August 1985. Jean-Michel Crevecoeur and Nadine Mauriat were honeymooning in Tuscany, young and in love, soaking in the beauty of the Italian countryside. They pitched their tent in what seemed like a peaceful spot near San Casciano, not knowing they had just entered the monster's territory. On the morning of September 8th, a farmer discovered their bodies. The monster had attacked with his usual precision, the .22 Beretta, the methodical execution. But this time, he'd added a new element to his ritual. He'd left Nadine's body posed in a specific way, almost theatrical, as if he were an artist displaying his work. And he'd taken something. A piece of her, cut with what forensic examiners determined was a sharp blade, possibly a scalpel. The precision of the cut suggested medical knowledge, or at least someone who'd done this many times before. The murder of the French tourists created an international incident. The French government demanded answers. The Italian press turned on the police, accusing them of incompetence. Chief Inspector Della Monica faced calls for his resignation. The pressure was unbearable. In desperation, police arrested Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer with a violent past. He'd killed a traveling salesman years earlier in a jealous rage. He was strange, solitary, known to spy on couples in the countryside. He seemed perfect for the role of monster. But was he, or were the police so desperate for an arrest that they'd convinced themselves of his guilt? The trial of Pietro Pacciani began in 1994, nearly a decade after the last known killing. The courtroom in Florence was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. This was it, the moment Italy had been waiting for. The monster would finally face justice. The prosecution's case seemed strong at first. Pacciani lived near several of the crime scenes. He owned weapons. He had a history of violence. Witnesses testified that he was obsessed with young couples, that he would watch them from the shadows. But then the defense began to poke holes in the case. Where was the .22 Beretta? Never found. Where was the physical evidence linking Pacciani to the crimes? Circumstantial at best. And most damning of all, Pacciani seemed too simple, too unsophisticated to have executed such methodical crimes. Criminal psychologist Bruno took the stand and delivered testimony that sent murmurs through the courtroom. The monster of Florence displays a level of planning and self-control that suggests intelligence, education, and social awareness. Pietro Pacciani, with all due respect, does not fit this profile. Still, on November 1st, 1994, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Pacciani was sentenced to life in prison. The case was closed. Florence could finally breathe again. Except it wasn't over. Not even close. February 1996. In a stunning reversal, an appeals court overturned Pacciani's conviction due to insufficient evidence. He walked free, a broken man who'd spent 2 years in prison for crimes he may not have committed. But the prosecution wasn't finished. If Pacciani didn't act alone, they reasoned, perhaps he'd been part of a group. They arrested 2 of his former friends, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, accusing them of being accomplices in the murders. During interrogation, Lottie confessed. He described in graphic detail how he, Vanni, and Pacciani had committed the murders together, how they'd stalked couples, how they'd performed the mutilations. It seemed like the final piece of the puzzle. But something didn't add up. Lottie's confession contained errors, details that didn't match the crime scenes, timelines that didn't work. Some investigators believed he was simply telling the police what they wanted to hear, perhaps in exchange for a lighter sentence. Chief Inspector Ruggero Perugini, who'd taken over the investigation, sat in his office late one night, surrounded by case files and crime scene photos. He'd devoted years of his life to catching the monster, and he still wasn't sure they had the right people. "What if we've been looking at this all wrong?" he asked his deputy. "What if the monster was never one of these men?" The question hung in the air like smoke. If not them, then who? As the case dragged on through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, alternative theories began to emerge. Some investigators believed the murders were connected to a satanic cult, pointing to the ritualistic nature of the mutilations and the way body parts had been removed as if for ceremonial purposes. Author Thomas Harris visited Florence while researching for his novel Hannibal and drew inspiration from the monster case. The idea that a sophisticated, cultured killer could hide in plain sight fascinated him. Was the monster someone respectable, someone above suspicion? Journalist Mario Spizzi and American author Douglas Preston spent years investigating the case independently. Their book, The Monster of Florence, proposed that a group of wealthy, powerful men had orchestrated the killings as part of occult rituals. They suggested the truth had been covered up at the highest levels. For their trouble, both men became targets of the investigation themselves. Preston was nearly arrested. Spizzi was interrogated for hours. The case had become so twisted, so convoluted, that investigators were now chasing the investigators. Meanwhile, Pietro Pacciani died in 2000, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Vanni and Lottie remained in prison, still claiming innocence despite Lottie's confession. And the families of the victims were left with more questions than answers. Who had really killed their loved ones? And why? Today, more than 40 years after the last killing, Italy still doesn't know the full truth about the monster of Florence. The official count stands at 16 victims across 8 separate attacks between 1968 and 1985, all killed with the same .22 Beretta, all young couples seeking privacy in the Tuscan countryside. But here's what keeps investigators up at night. The .22 Beretta used in all the killings was traced to a murder in 1968. The very first killing of Barbara Lacci and Antonio Lo Bianco. That gun had been in evidence for years after that initial crime, supposedly secure in a police property room. How did the monster get access to it? Did someone in law enforcement give it to him? Was there a conspiracy within the police force itself? These questions have never been answered. And then there are the gaps in the timeline. Why did the monster wait 6 years between his first and second attacks? Why did he stop completely after 1985? Did he die? Was he arrested for another crime? Or did he simply decide he'd had enough? Some investigators believe the monster is still alive, living somewhere in Italy, an old man now, carrying the weight of 16 murders. Others think he died long ago, his identity lost to time. The truth is, we may never know. The monster of Florence changed Italy forever. The case exposed weaknesses in the Italian judicial system, showed how investigations could be derailed by ego and politics, and demonstrated the dangers of rushing to judgment without solid evidence. For the victims' families, there has never been closure. They've watched as suspect after suspect was paraded before cameras, as theories were proposed and discarded, as the truth seemed to slip further and further away with each passing year. The case also changed how Italians viewed their countryside. Those romantic lanes and secluded clearings, once symbols of youthful freedom and romance, became places of fear. Even today, older Italians remember the warnings. Don't park in the countryside. Don't become the monster's next victim. The psychological impact extended beyond Italy's borders. The case inspired countless books, documentaries, and fictional works. It became a reference point for discussions about serial killers, about the nature of evil, about how someone could commit such horrors and then return to normal life, perhaps sleeping peacefully while the whole country searched for him. Criminologist Alessandro Maluzzi perhaps put it best. The monster of Florence is a mirror held up to Italian society. In trying to find him, we discovered uncomfortable truths about ourselves. So where does that leave us? Sitting here decades later, no closer to the truth than we were in 1968. The most terrifying aspect of the Monster of Florence case isn't the violence, as brutal as it was. It's the uncertainty. It's the knowledge that someone capable of such methodical evil could blend seamlessly into society. Could be anyone, a farmer, a professional, a family man. It's the realization that the person sitting next to you on the bus, the man selling you groceries, the neighbor who waves hello every morning, could be hiding unimaginable darkness inside. The Monster of Florence was never conclusively identified. He may have died without ever facing justice for his crimes. Or he may still be out there, an elderly man now watching documentaries about himself, reading books about his crimes, smiling at how close they came but never quite caught him. 16 young people lost their lives in the Tuscan countryside between 1968 and 1985. They were sons and daughters, lovers and dreamers, people with futures that were violently stolen from them. They deserve justice, and they deserve to be remembered as more than just victims of a monster. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the rain, remember their names. Barbara Lacci, Antonio Lo Bianco, Pasquale Gentilcore, Stefania Pettini, Giovanni Foggi, Carmela Danuccio, Paolo Mainardi, Antonella Migliorini, Horst Meyer, Uwe Rush, Pia Rontini, Claudio Stefanaxi, Jean-Michel Creveikvalai, Nadine Mauriat, and two whose names are lost to time. The Monster of Florence may never be caught, but these 16 lives will never be forgotten. And somewhere in Italy, the truth still waits to be discovered. In the heart of British Columbia, Canada, there exists a highway that has claimed more lives than any documented serial killer in North American history. Highway 16, a 724-kilometer stretch connecting Prince Rupert to Prince George, has another name among local residents, a name whispered with fear and pain, the Highway of Tears. And what makes this highway truly terrifying is not a single monster, but the possibility that multiple predators have been hunting along it for more than 5 decades. Where are you joining us from tonight? What time is it where you are right now? If you're looking for true stories to keep you awake while the rain falls, this is your refuge. Hit the subscribe button, turn on all notifications, give us a like, and share this video with someone who can't resist the darkest mysteries. Every interaction allows us to continue investigating the cases authorities prefer to forget. On June 11, 1969, a 19-year-old woman named Gloria Moody disappeared without a trace while hitchhiking on Highway 16. Her body was never found. Authorities filed the case as a voluntary disappearance, assuming she had simply decided to start a new life elsewhere. But what they didn't know was that Gloria would be only the first in a long list of women who would vanish on that highway as if the earth itself had swallowed them. What investigators would discover decades later about that stretch of asphalt would make them question whether they had been chasing a single killer or something far more sinister. Over the next 40 years, more women began to disappear along Highway 16. At first, the disappearances seemed like isolated events, individual tragedies with no apparent connection. Monica Ignaz, 15 years old, disappeared in 1974. Ramona Wilson, 16 years old, found dead in 1995. Roxanne Thiara, 15 years old, disappeared in 1994. The names accumulated like invisible tombstones along the highway. What was most disturbing was that most of the victims shared similar characteristics. They were young, many of them teenagers. Most were indigenous women from First Nations communities, belonging to populations that already faced systematic discrimination and extreme poverty. Almost all had been hitchhiking when they disappeared, a common practice in a region where public transportation was virtually non-existent, and many families couldn't afford a vehicle. But there was something else in the pattern that investigators didn't notice for years. The disappearances occurred more frequently during the summer months, between June and September, when the days were longer and more people traveled the highway. The bodies that were found showed signs of extreme sexual violence and had been abandoned in remote forested areas, places so isolated that some weren't discovered until months or even years later. Whoever was doing this knew the territory intimately, knew exactly where they could hide their crimes without being detected. And what they would discover about the region's geography would reveal why this highway had become the perfect hunting ground for human predators. Highway 16 crosses through some of the most remote and wild terrain in North America. On both sides of the highway stretch dense coniferous forests that can swallow a person in seconds. Mountains rise abruptly, creating deep ravines and isolated valleys where a scream wouldn't reach any human ear. During winter, temperatures drop brutally, and during summer, mosquitoes and thick vegetation make venturing into the forest an exhausting experience. Sergeant Wayne Clary of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been assigned to the region for 15 years when he finally began connecting the dots in 2005. Sitting in his office in Smithers, a small town halfway along Highway 16, he spread out a map of the region and began marking each location where a woman had disappeared or where a body had been found. What he saw took his breath away. The marks formed a pattern along the highway, but they weren't uniformly distributed. They clustered in specific areas, near rest stops, on stretches where the highway crossed particularly isolated zones, at points where motorists frequently picked up hitchhikers. It's as if someone had studied the highway, Clary told his colleague, Detective Laurie Shenher, as if they knew exactly where to attack to maximize the chances of escaping without being seen. But what disturbed him most was something else he had noticed on the map, something that suggested they weren't dealing with a single predator. The dates didn't match. If all these disappearances and murders were the work of a single person, that person would have been active for more than 30 years, from the late 60s to the early 2000s. Although it wasn't impossible for a serial killer to operate for that long, something in the details of the crimes didn't fit that theory. The methods varied too much, the frequency was inconsistent, and some of the murders showed completely different levels of brutality. Dr. Michael Arntfield, a criminologist from Western Ontario University specializing in serial killers, was consulted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 2006. After reviewing the available case files, his conclusion was chilling. "You're not looking for one killer," he told investigators during a video conference. "You're looking for several." This highway has attracted multiple predators over the decades, each one taking advantage of the same systemic vulnerabilities. Arntfield explained that Highway 16 represented what he called a perfect hunting ecosystem for human predators. Potential victims were abundant and vulnerable. Law enforcement was limited due to the vastness of the territory. Indigenous communities, where many of the victims came from, had learned to distrust the police due to decades of institutional racism and neglect. And most importantly, the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictions, making coordination between different police departments difficult. It was, in essence, the ideal place for a killer to operate with almost total impunity. But there was one specific case that would make Arntfield's entire theory take on an even more sinister meaning. Chapter 5. Nicole Hoare and the Turning Point. On June 21, 2002, Nicole Hoare, a 25-year-old white middle-class woman, disappeared while hitchhiking on Highway 16. Nicole was different from most of the previous victims. She was a university graduate, sister to a prominent lawyer, and came from a family with resources and connections. Her disappearance finally provoked the reaction that Indigenous families had been begging for during decades: national media attention and an exhaustive police investigation. The Hoare family didn't accept the police's vague answers. They hired private investigators, organized massive searches, pressured politicians, and most importantly, began asking questions about all the other women who had disappeared on the same highway. "Why is no one talking about the other girls?" asked Nicole's sister, Cara, at a 2003 press conference. "Why is it only now, when a white woman disappears, that everyone pays attention?" Cara Hoare's question resonated like thunder throughout Canada. The media began investigating, and what they discovered was shameful. Dozens of cases of missing Indigenous women had been filed with minimal or non-existent investigations. Families who had reported their daughters missing were ignored or, worse yet, blamed by police officers themselves who assumed the victims were involved in prostitution or drugs without any evidence. Systemic racism had not only allowed these women to disappear, but had protected their killers by ensuring no one would seek justice. And what would emerge from this new media attention would be a name that would horrify the entire nation. In 2006, a long-haul truck driver named Bobby Jack Fowler emerged as a prime suspect in several of the Highway of Tears murders. Fowler, an American from Oregon, had worked as a truck driver on routes that regularly took him through British Columbia during the 70s and 80s. He had an extensive criminal record of sexual assaults and had served time in prison for multiple rapes. The breakthrough came when Fowler's DNA, collected after his arrest in the United States for another crime, matched forensic evidence found on the body of one of the Highway of Tears victims, Colleen Macmillan, 16 years old, murdered in 1974. It was the physical connection that investigators had been searching for during decades. Finally, they had irrefutable proof that at least one of the Highway's killers had a name. But there was a devastating problem. Bobby Jack Fowler had died of cancer in an Oregon prison in 2006, before the DNA match was discovered. He would never face trial, never be interrogated about how many other women he had killed, and never reveal where he had hidden the bodies that still hadn't been found. His death closed a crucial door in the investigation, but opened another, even more disturbing question. If Fowler was responsible for some of the murders, who was responsible for the others? Because DNA analysis of the available crime scenes would reveal something no investigator wanted to hear. Forensic analysis of the cases where biological evidence had been recovered showed something that confirmed Dr. Arntfield's worst suspicions. There were multiple DNA profiles that didn't match Bobby Jack Fowler. This meant, without any doubt, that multiple killers had been operating on the Highway of Tears. The question was, how many? Detective Laurie Shunher, who had spent years working on missing women cases, organized a special meeting with criminologists, FBI profilers, and serial killer experts from across North America. In a conference room in Vancouver, she presented everything they knew. The data was overwhelming. Between 1969 and 2011, at least 18 women had been murdered or disappeared along Highway 16. But Indigenous rights organizations argued that the real number could be much higher, perhaps 40 or even 50 victims, whose cases were never officially reported or were filed without investigation. What we have here, explained FBI Special Agent Marcus Wright during the meeting, is what we call a hunting corridor. It's similar to what we saw with I-45 in Texas, where multiple killers used the same highway to find victims. Highway 16 offers everything a sexual predator looks for: vulnerable victims, extreme isolation, and fragmented law enforcement. Wright paused, letting his words settle. But there's something else you need to consider. Something that makes this case unique. What he was about to reveal would completely change the focus of the investigation. Agent Wright unfolded a map of North America on the conference room wall. With a red marker, he traced a line that followed Highway 16 in British Columbia, but then continued south, connecting with Interstate 5 running down the west coast to California, and east connecting with the Trans-Canada Highway that crossed the entire country. Long-haul truckers, Wright said, have access to thousands of kilometers of highways and a seemingly infinite supply of potential victims at every stop. Wright had been investigating a disturbing pattern of unsolved murders along major transportation routes in North America. He had identified more than 500 cases of women murdered or disappeared near interstate highways and major roads in the last 30 years. Many of the victims were sex workers or hitchhikers. The bodies, when they were found, had been abandoned at rest areas or in forests adjacent to the highways. Bobby Jack Fowler was a trucker, Wright continued, and he probably wasn't the only one using his profession to hunt. The FBI estimates that at any given time, there could be between 25 and 50 active serial killers in the United States, and a significant proportion of them are truckers or people whose occupations require extensive travel. The room fell silent. The implication was clear. The Highway of Tears wasn't just the hunting territory of one or two killers, but potentially a way station for predators traveling across the continent. And there was a case that would prove this theory in a chilling way: In 2007, Canadian authorities were contacted by investigators from Alaska with information about a case that would freeze their blood. A trucker named Robert Hansen had been arrested in 1983 for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of at least 17 women in Alaska. Hansen's modus operandi was terrifying. He would pick up women in Anchorage, take them to a remote cabin in the wilderness, release them, and then hunt them with a rifle as if they were animals. What connected Hansen to the Highway of Tears was his work route. During the 70s, Hansen had occasionally worked transporting cargo between Alaska and the Pacific Northwest states, a route that took him directly through Highway 16. Several witnesses remembered seeing his truck at rest stops along the highway. Although Hansen had died in prison in 2014 without confessing to any crimes in Canada, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that he had practiced his predation in British Columbia before escalating his crimes in Alaska. But Hansen wasn't the only suspect trucker. Police files contained references to other drivers who had been briefly questioned over the years but were never thoroughly investigated. An unidentified trucker who had attempted to attack a young woman in 1988 but who had escaped and reported the incident. Another driver who was seen arguing violently with a young woman at a rest stop hours before she disappeared. These fragments of information, ignored for decades, now painted a terrifying picture of a transportation corridor where multiple predators operated with almost total impunity. And what surviving victims would finally reveal would be even more disturbing. In 2009, a non-governmental organization called Women in March began collecting testimonies from Indigenous women who had survived kidnapping or assault attempts along Highway 16. What emerged from these interviews was a catalog of horror that had remained hidden for decades because no one had wanted to listen. Sarah Morrison, a woman from the Gikson Nation, described how in 1997, when she was 17 years old, she had accepted a ride from a truck driver who seemed friendly. Within minutes of entering the vehicle, the man began making explicit sexual comments. When Sarah demanded he let her out, he accelerated and activated the door locks. "He told me he knew of a place in the forest where no one would find me," Sarah recalled with a trembling voice. "He said he had taken other girls there before." Sarah only managed to escape when the truck had to stop at a traffic light on the outskirts of Terrace, and she broke the window and jumped from the moving vehicle. There were dozens of similar stories. Women who had been attacked but managed to escape. Women who reported the incidents to police only to be dismissed with comments like, "What did you expect hitchhiking?" Or, "You probably just wanted a free ride and then changed your mind." The pattern of police negligence was systematic and devastating. Each missed opportunity to arrest an aggressor meant he could attack again, and the next victim might not be lucky enough to escape. And among all these testimonies, there was one that would identify a predator who was still active and hunting. During interviews with survivors, one specific detail began to repeat with alarming frequency. Multiple women described being approached by a man driving a white pickup truck, specifically a Ford from the late 90s or early 2000s. The man was described as middle-aged, with dark hair and a well-groomed beard, and always wore a baseball cap. His tactic was consistent. He would offer help to women who were hitchhiking, seemed kind and trustworthy at first, and then revealed his true intentions once the victim was isolated. Detective Shunher ordered a search of the police database for all reports that mentioned a white pickup truck in connection with incidents along Highway 16. What she found was astonishing. There were at least 15 different reports, dating from 1998 to 2008, that mentioned a similar vehicle. Some were reports of failed sexual assaults. Others were sightings of a suspicious vehicle near where a woman had last been seen. What was most frustrating was that police had never connected these reports. Each one had been handled by different jurisdictions, filed separately, and never cross-referenced with other similar cases. If someone had taken the time to look for patterns, the man in the white truck could have been identified years earlier. Now, the urgent question was he still active? Was he still hunting on the Highway of Tears? The answer would come in a way no one anticipated. On November 27, 2010, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer stopped a pickup truck on the outskirts of Prince George for a minor traffic violation. The driver was a 20-year-old man named Cody Allen Leijbokoff. During the routine stop, the officer noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the back seat of the vehicle. A more detailed search revealed women's clothing, makeup, and a driver's license belonging to a woman who had been reported missing days earlier. The subsequent investigation would discover that Leijbokoff was responsible for the murder of at least 4 young women between 2009 and 2010. His victims included Jill Stachenko, Cynthia Moss, Natasha Montgomery, and Loren Leslie. All had been brutally murdered, and their bodies had been abandoned in remote areas near Highway 16. Leijbokoff, who worked in the lumber industry, knew the territory intimately and had used that knowledge to hide his crimes. What horrified investigators wasn't just the brutality of Leijbokoff's crimes, but his age. At 20 years old, he was already an active serial killer. This suggested he had begun killing as a teenager and raised a chilling question. How had he learned to do this? Had he had a mentor? Had he been inspired by the uncaptured killers of the Highway of Tears? The forensic psychologists who interviewed him after his arrest would discover something that would connect Leijbokoff to the broader pattern of violence in the region in a way no one had anticipated. During psychological evaluations, Leijbokoff revealed that he had grown up hearing stories about the missing women of Highway 16. In his twisted mind, the Highway of Tears wasn't a place of tragedy, but of opportunity. "I knew I could get away with it," he told Dr. Patrick Bailey, a forensic psychologist. "So many others had done it before. Why not me?" This revelation exposed something deeply disturbing about the impact of unsolved crimes. The impunity of previous killers hadn't just caused immediate pain to victims' families, but had created a cascade effect, inspiring a new generation of predators who saw the highway as hunting territory where they could operate without consequences. Leijbokoff had been, in essence, radicalized by the region's history of violence. In 2014, Cody Leijbokoff was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. He was the youngest serial killer in Canadian history, but his capture didn't bring the closure many had hoped for, because even while Leijbokoff was being tried, another woman disappeared on Highway 16. Madison Scott, 20 years old, was last seen in May 2011 at a campground near Vanderhoof. Her truck was found abandoned, but there was no sign of Madison. The case remains unsolved. The Highway of Tears continued to claim victims, and what this meant was clear and terrifying. Detective Shunher retired in 2013, frustrated by decades of institutional neglect and lack of resources to solve the Highway of Tears cases. In her memoir, That Lonely Section of Hell, she wrote bitterly about a system that had consistently failed the most vulnerable victims. "For every killer we capture," she wrote, "there are probably 3 or 4 more who will never be identified." Statistical analysis supported her pessimism. Of the at least 18 confirmed victims along Highway 16, only 3 cases had been definitively solved. That of Colleen Macmillan, linked to Bobby Jack Fowler, and 2 of Cody Leijbokoff's victims. That left 15 unsolved murders, and possibly dozens more that were never officially documented. The math was simple and devastating. There were killers who had murdered on the Highway of Tears and never faced justice. But there were signs that some of these killers were still active. In 2015, a woman reported being attacked by a man in a pickup truck near Burns Lake, a town on Highway 16. The description of the aggressor matched reports from the 2000s of the man in the white truck. In 2017, another woman escaped an attempted kidnapping under similar circumstances. The predators of the Highway of Tears hadn't stopped. They had simply become more careful. And what indigenous organizations would discover about the true magnitude of the problem would make the official numbers seem like an insignificant fraction of reality. Chapter 15. The Invisible Victims. In 2019, the organization Families of the Missing published a report that shook Canada. After years of independent research, they had documented 43 cases of Indigenous women who had disappeared or been murdered along Highway 16 between 1969 and 2018. This was more than double the official number recognized by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. How was such a discrepancy possible? The answer was as simple as it was heartbreaking. Many of the additional victims had never been officially reported as missing. Some families, especially in remote indigenous communities, had learned that reporting a disappearance to police was futile. Officers frequently assumed the missing person was on a bender or had left the community voluntarily. Searches, when they occurred, were minimal and short-lived. Cases were quickly filed away. Brenda Wilson, whose sister Ramona was murdered in 1994, explained the brutal reality during a 2019 public hearing. When a white girl disappears, there are press conferences, helicopter searches, rewards. When an indigenous girl disappears, they tell us she's probably drunk somewhere. That's the truth no one wants to admit. Her words resonated throughout the country, finally forcing a national conversation about the systemic racism that had allowed the Highway of Tears to become a cemetery for indigenous women. But even this renewed attention wouldn't prepare anyone for what was about to be revealed. In 2016, the Canadian government finally launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For 3 years, the Commission heard testimonies from survivors, families, experts, and authorities. What emerged was a systematic portrait of neglect, racism, and violence that went far beyond the Highway of Tears. The Commission documented more than 1,200 cases of murdered or missing Indigenous women across Canada since 1980. Indigenous women, who represented only 4% of Canada's female population, constituted 16% of all women murdered in the country. In some provinces, an Indigenous woman was up to 12 times more likely to be murdered or disappear than a non-Indigenous woman. These weren't just numbers. Each statistic represented a stolen life, a shattered family, a traumatized community. The Commission's final report, published in 2019, used a term that surprised many Canadians but that Indigenous communities had been using for decades: genocide. Violence against Indigenous women, the report concluded, was part of a broader pattern of historical and contemporary genocide against the Indigenous peoples of Canada. The Highway of Tears was just the most visible symbol of a national crisis that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. And what the report's recommendations would reveal was that solving these crimes would require something more than traditional police work. The National Inquiry Report identified multiple systemic failures that had allowed violence against Indigenous women to continue unchecked. The first and most obvious was jurisdictional fragmentation. Highway 16 crossed multiple police territories, including jurisdictions of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, municipal police, and First Nations territories. This fragmentation meant that no single agency had a complete view of all the crimes, making it difficult to identify patterns. The second failure was the lack of resources specifically dedicated to cases of missing Indigenous persons. While high-profile cases of missing white people received immediate attention and substantial resources, cases of Indigenous women frequently languished on desks with minimal investigations. An analysis of police files showed that the average investigation time dedicated to a missing Indigenous woman case was less than half the time dedicated to similar cases of non-Indigenous women. The third failure, and perhaps the most insidious, was implicit and explicit bias among law enforcement officers. Multiple testimonies documented police officers who had dismissed reports of missing Indigenous women with racist comments, automatically assuming the victims were involved in criminal activities or had left their communities voluntarily. This bias not only delayed crucial investigations, but also demoralized families and communities, making them less likely to report future disappearances. And there was a fourth factor that no one had fully considered until a forensic anthropologist made a chilling discovery. Dr. Owen Beattie, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alberta, was hired in 2015 to assess whether there were areas along Highway 16 that might contain undiscovered human remains. Using terrain analysis, historical data about where bodies had been found previously, and behavioral models of serial killers, he identified 23 high-probability sites that should be investigated. With limited funding, Dr. Beattie was able to conduct detailed searches at only 5 of these sites between 2016 and 2018. At 3 of the 5 sites, they found human remains. 2 of the sets of remains were identified as belonging to women who had been reported missing in the 90s. The third set of remains belonged to a woman who was never identified and whose disappearance apparently was never officially reported. What this tells us, Dr. Beatty explained in a 2018 interview, is that there are probably dozens, possibly hundreds, of disposal sites along this highway that have never been investigated. The forests of British Columbia are vast and dense. A body can be just 50 meters from the highway and remain undiscovered for decades, or forever. He paused, his expression somber. The true magnitude of what has occurred on the Highway of Tears will probably never be fully known. His words proved prophetic when, months after his statement, an accidental discovery would reveal exactly how correct his assessment was. In September 2019, a hiker named Thomas Chun had wandered off a marked trail near Morris River, approximately 30 kilometers south of Highway 16. While trying to find his way back, he literally tripped over something protruding from the earth, human bones. Police were called immediately, and a more thorough search of the area revealed the skeletal remains of 3 different individuals, all buried in an area of approximately 100 square meters. Forensic analysis determined that the remains belonged to 3 young women, all probably murdered between the late 80s and early 90s. One of the victims was eventually identified as Delphine Nichol, a 16-year-old woman from the Natahi Nation who had disappeared in 1990. Her family had been searching for answers for nearly 30 years, and they could finally bring Delphine home for a proper burial. The other 2 victims were never identified. Despite comparing them with DNA profiles from families of missing women, searching databases of missing persons across North America, and facial reconstructions, the 2 women remained as Jane Does. "This is what haunts me most," said Detective Constable Annie Linteau, who led the forensic investigation. "These women had families, they had lives, they had names, and they're so completely erased that we can't even return their identity to them." The discovery raised a terrifying question. If this single site contained 3 bodies, how many other similar sites were there along the highway? And more importantly, who had put them there? Chapter 20, The Legacy of Tears. Today, in 2026, Highway 16 still stretches through the heart of British Columbia, connecting isolated communities with the outside world. Improvements in public transportation have reduced the need for hitchhiking, but haven't eliminated it completely. Indigenous women still disappear, though less frequently than in past decades. Progress has been real but insufficient. Of the estimated 40 to 50 cases of women murdered or disappeared along the Highway of Tears, only a handful have been solved. Bobby Jack Fowler and Cody Leachbokoff are the only definitively identified killers, and together they're responsible for perhaps 6 victims. This leaves between 34 and 44 unsolved murders, crimes committed by predators who remain unidentified and possibly still alive. Some of these killers have probably died of natural causes, taking their secrets to the grave. Others may be in prison for unrelated crimes, their murders on the Highway of Tears never connected to them. And some, investigators fear, are still free, perhaps still hunting in the shadows of British Columbia's forests, or on other remote highways where vulnerable victims are abundant and surveillance is scarce. Indigenous organizations continue pressing for justice, for more resources for investigations, for systemic changes in how police handle missing persons cases. Some progress has been made. There are specialized teams dedicated to cases of missing Indigenous persons, better coordination between jurisdictions, and greater public awareness about the crisis. But for the families still waiting for answers, these changes came decades too late. On the outskirts of Prince George, there is a monument dedicated to the victims of the Highway of Tears. It consists of wooden posts carved with the names of the known women who disappeared or were murdered. There are 18 names on those posts, but there is space for more, a silent acknowledgement that the list isn't complete and probably never will be. Families visit the monument regularly, leaving flowers, photographs, and personal objects. It is a place of pain, but also of remembrance and resistance. Each name carved in the wood is a refusal to allow these women to be forgotten, a statement that their lives mattered, that they matter, and that the search for justice continues. The Highway of Tears remains a brutal reminder of what happens when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. It is a story of systemic racism, institutional neglect, and gender violence that was allowed to flourish for decades. But it is also a story of families who refused to give up, of communities that rose up to demand justice, and of the slow, painful evolution of a country that finally began to listen. On quiet nights, when you drive along Highway 16 and the forest closes in on both sides of the highway, it's easy to imagine the stories the trees could tell. Stories of terror and loss, of young women whose lives were stolen too soon, of families shattered by unanswered questions. The highway remains, indifferent to the pain it has witnessed, continuing its path through the wilderness. And somewhere, in police archives, in the memories of retired investigators, in the nightmares of survivors, there are answers waiting to be discovered. There are killers who never faced justice, victims who were never identified, and families who never received closure. The Highway of Tears guards its secrets jealously, but the search for truth continues, because each of these women deserves to be remembered. Each family deserves answers. And each killer, no matter how much time has passed, deserves to face the consequences of their actions. Justice may be slow, it may be imperfect, but as long as there are those who refuse to forget, as long as there are voices demanding answers, the story of the Highway of Tears is not finished. This is a true crime story, but more than that, it is a story about courage, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for dignity and justice. It is a reminder that unsolved crimes are not just statistics, but human tragedies that continue to resonate through generations. And it is a warning that when a society fails to protect the most vulnerable among us, we all pay the price in our collective humanity.